The greatest stories often start with humble beginnings. So it was that on a quiet night in May of 1867, a young boy named Giuseppe Morello was brought into this world. His father, Calogero Morello, stifled a gasp when he first saw his son. The baby was born with a deformed right hand, just one extra hardship in a land born of suffering. This deformity would earn him a nickname later in life that would strike fear into the streets of New York. But that was years into the future. For now, he was just another poor child with a handicap. Despite this deformity, his parents loved the boy dearly. Every day, mother and son would see Calogero off to his toils. His father worked hard as a day laborer in Corleone, Sicily, where he scratched out a living to support his wife, Angela Piazza, and their newborn son. Times were tough in mid-19th century Sicily. The Kingdom of Italy taxed the peasant population heavily. Soldiers from the mainland instituted martial law, making life unlivable for the Sicilian peasantry. With no one else to turn to, local familial clans known as the Mafia began popping up and serving as protectors of the land and people from the kingdom's authoritarian regime. Over time, these protectors became the oppressors. Crime was rampant, and human suffering occurred on a large scale, with many dying before having the opportunity to grow old. Though blissfully unaware of it, this would be the fate of young Calogero. As he kissed his wife and young son goodbye on that bright fall day, none of them knew it would be for the final time. Angela Piazza Morello awoke in the wee hours of the morning to a loud pounding coming from the front door of the small cottage she shared with her husband. She turned instinctively to wake him, only to find his side of the bed completely empty. He had not come home last night. She rose from bed and put on her nightgown. Fear began to nibble at her insides, the way a rat will nibble at a piece of discarded cheese. Walking as if in a trance, Angela stopped and peeked through her small kitchen window on the way to the front door. Her heart immediately jumped in her chest, recognizing the man who was now waiting on her porch. His name was Bernardo Terranova, and he was a member of the widely feared Streva clan, a branch of the Sicilian Mafia in Corleone. The fear she felt transformed from a nibbling rat into a giant stallion, breaking the reins and trampling rational thought. She was deathly afraid to open the door, but she was even more afraid not to. Then, in a manner that was almost robotic, she gave in and turned the knob. But rather than appearing angry, she saw that the man had his cap in his hand and a sorrowful look on his face that was almost comic on his hard features. Then, with all the suddenness of a sweet surprise, a new fear swept through her. Where indeed was her husband? As if in answer to her question, the man spoke both quickly and softly in his coarse Sicilian dialect. "Senora, I am sorry to inform you that your husband has died in the service of my family. I am truly sorry for your loss. Custom dictates that you must fall under our protection until you remarry." Before she could muster up the courage to utter a single word, the man passed her an envelope stuffed with currency. "Take this. I'll be by again later," before briskly walking away. Suddenly, she was alone again. Closing the door, Angela finally allowed herself to breathe, and then, finally, she broke down into tears. The next day, she awoke again to the emptiness of the bed they had shared. This broke her heart all over again. However, Angela Piazza Morello was a woman of 19th century Sicily, and as such, was already accustomed to tragedy and suffering. So with a stoic and almost fatalistic sense of calm, she would claim her husband's body and make arrangements for his funeral. It was a small affair attended by a few friends and family. The only surprise visitor was Bernardo Terranova himself. He stayed at the periphery, however his presence was duly noted by all in attendance, including Angela. In the period following Calogero's death, Bernardo's visits came once a week, and Angela found herself with more money than she had when her husband was alive and working. As time passed, she began to wonder about this special treatment. Had her hard-working husband been in fact an associate of the Mafia? Or had he just happened to cross paths with the wrong man? The police gave her no answers regarding his death, and knowing what she knew about the law, she didn't expect any. Bernardo was closed-mouthed on the subject as well, and she supposed that in the grand scheme of things, it mattered little either way. What did matter was how Bernardo always made an excuse to stay for coffee when he brought her an envelope, or the way she'd occasionally catch him staring when he thought she wasn't looking. He would even play with Giuseppe, whom she affectionately nicknamed Pidu. He also didn't seem to mind Giuseppe's handicap, which she found endearing. Bernardo Terranova was a powerful man from a powerful family, and Angela was a practical woman, so after waiting what she felt was an appropriate period of time, she began to respond to Bernardo's advances. The romance that ensued was of the whirlwind variety. Still, the couple waited until after the customary year of mourning passed before they were married. Bernardo then moved both Angela and young Giuseppe to a small but well-furnished cottage on the estate that the Mafia protected for the Italian nobles who owned it. Angela knew never to ask Bernardo about his business. She was taught as a child to have a healthy fear of the Mafia, and this feeling remained despite sharing her home and bed with one of its members. This fear was made real one night when Bernardo came home late with blood all over his shirt and short of breath. He had a wild look in his eyes that deeply unsettled her. It was those eyes, and not the blood, that bothered her the most. In a state of shock, she heard herself asking Bernardo what had happened before she could stop herself. Bernardo just stared at her quietly and did not respond. The moment seemed to drag on forever, until a switch seemed to flick in her mind. Finally, she said in Sicilian, "Give me your clothes." A look was exchanged between them, and that look spoke 1,000 words that would be left unsaid. A moment later, Bernardo quietly undressed without protest and handed his clothes to his wife. Moments later, the clothes were in flames, burning in the cottage's wood stove. She had no memory of putting them there, but she must have, because there they sit burning to ash. That night, Angela made peace with being a Mafia wife, for better or for worse. Those early years would be happy ones, only occasionally marred by the tragedy that the 19th century was so famous for. Angela would bear Bernardo 7 children during those years. The first, a sickly boy named Vincenzo, died tragically at the age of 2. Shortly after his death, a second son would be born, and his name would also be Vincenzo. 2 more sons would follow. They would be named Ciro and Nicolo. She also bore him 3 daughters named Lucia, Salvatrice, and Rosalia. As for his stepson, Bernardo treated Giuseppe just like one of his own. Giuseppe still carried a chip on his shoulder nonetheless. He would grow from a small, handicapped child into a wiry, strong youth, beating would-be bullies who thought he might be an easy target because of his deformed hand. It was this streak of toughness that brought Giuseppe into his stepfather's world early on at the tender age of only 14. So it was that on a quiet night in midsummer, Giuseppe awoke to a large racket coming from outside his cottage. Running from his room, Giuseppe saw his stepfather and another man carrying his stepfather's uncle. This uncle, a man named Paolo Streva, was the patriarch of the local Mafia clan. "Pidu," his stepfather screamed, seeing Giuseppe at the cottage door. "Go to the village and fetch Dr. Matteo, and be quick." Without saying another word, Giuseppe broke into an all-out sprint in the direction of Corleone. Through the quiet of the night, he sprinted, entering the town of Corleone. He continued to run until finally arriving in its most well-to-do neighborhood. Approaching a beautiful home, Giuseppe paused for a moment to catch his breath. He then walked up to the door and yelled, "Dr. Matteo!" With no immediate response, Giuseppe began to pound on the door of the doctor's small but elegant domicile. Waking from a deep slumber, the doctor finally appeared at the door in his nightclothes. "What troubles you, young man?" the doctor managed to stammer out while staring at the excitable youth before him. "My padrino, he's..." Giuseppe paused for a moment, searching for a word his stepfather would approve of. "He's fallen ill," Giuseppe finally said softly. Recognizing the boy before him, the doctor spoke quickly. "Okay, give me a moment to gather my instruments." Before long, he and the doctor were walking briskly back to the estate. The doctor arrived and immediately began working on the family patriarch. Meanwhile, outside Streva's home, more than a dozen men had gathered. Giuseppe listened closely to his father and the other Streva men, speaking in hushed tones. As sound became speech, Giuseppe realized that these men were in fact planning to kill someone. After a moment of discussion, Bernardo turned to his stepson and looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. His next words were spoken with savage affection. "Pidu, tonight we will do things, and we will never speak of them again. Do you understand?" Young Giuseppe just nodded his head. He did understand. After confirming the perpetrator's identity, a group of 5 men, including Giuseppe and Bernardo, set out to find this would-be assassin. As they walked, Morello waited for panic to rise up from his heart and strangle his breath. But the feeling never came. Upon arriving at the home of the assassin, Bernardo turned to Giuseppe. "Stand lookout. If there's trouble, whistle like I taught you." Giuseppe again nodded without speaking. Then Bernardo and his men entered the house. It was no longer than 5 minutes before the men exited, this time dragging the body of a teenage boy from the entrance. The look of horror on the dead boy's face would be seared into young Giuseppe's mind for decades to come. That evening, the perpetrator, along with his wife and teenage son, were all garroted and left in the street. Their bodies were to be displayed as a warning to others who might challenge the might of the Mafia. On this night, Giuseppe Morello Terranova had learned what it meant to take another man's life. It was a lesson he would learn well. After the deed was done, the men returned to the estate, arriving just before sunrise. Upon entering their home, Bernardo spoke quietly to his stepson. "When the sun rises in the morning, you will be known as Giuseppe Terranova. You will be my true son." He then hugged his stepson for the first time since he was a small boy. Hearing those words and feeling that embrace made Giuseppe flush with pride. For a moment, he was able to forget the face of the boy, who was around his age, that his father had likely strangled just hours before. That face would return in time. The two then released each other and went to bed. As time marched on, Giuseppe grew into a strong, able-bodied young man. During the day, he cared for his younger siblings at home, while in the evenings, he would learn the conduct of a mafioso as well as the code of omertà from his stepfather. Though he was raised within the clan and had already participated in 2 murders, Giuseppe still had a formal induction into the Mafia on his 18th birthday. A gun, a knife, and a rope were present in the room. So was his stepfather and his stepfather's uncle, Paolo Streva. That night, he pledged his life to the clan. When it was over, he was officially a member of the Sicilian Mafia, though no certificate would ever be given, nor any official badge received. His was an oath bathed in blood and sanctified by fire. He was la Cosa Nostra. This fluid passage of time saw Giuseppe into his 20s. His younger half-brothers, Vincenzo, Niccolo, and Ciro, all looked up to him. Also, on most occasions, his stepfather was generally pleased with him as well. All were raised in the Sicilian tradition of not trusting authority, and all learned the code of omertà at an early age. Becoming more involved in the day-to-day Mafia business left Giuseppe working in town more and more frequently. The clan had an extensive protection racket, so Giuseppe would often be sent into the village by his stepfather, or Don Streva, to pick up payments and deliver messages. When on such an errand, he would often stop at one of the town's many cafes for coffee and a bite to eat. One afternoon, he noticed a young girl working in a cafe where he often had his evening espresso. Her name was Maria Rosa Marsalisi. This girl of rare beauty began to dominate Giuseppe's every waking thought. It would not be long before he was stopping by the same cafe daily for coffee, sometimes more than once. Soon they were chatting the afternoons away, laughing and joking with each other as if they had been friends for years. The young girl had brought a playful sense of humor out of Giuseppe that simply wasn't there before. It wasn't long before the two were infatuated with each other. For her part, she was fascinated by his life as a member of the Mafia, though the two never discussed such matters. She also liked that she could bring a softer side out of the young man. He in turn became enchanted by her curiosity and the ease with which she laughed. Indeed, the two found each other good company. It wasn't long before Giuseppe was head over heels in love. He kept these feelings to himself for a time. Then, after some months, he decided to make his intentions known. Maria felt strongly about him as well, but she was unsure of how serious he was about her. She had been told often enough by her mother how a man could take advantage of a girl's emotions. She, however, did not sense that from Giuseppe. On this fine spring day, she was about to find out how serious his intentions were. With a small velvet box in his hand, Giuseppe made his way to the table in the rear of the cafe. When Maria approached, her face darkened when she noticed him in such a nervous and excited state. She stopped and took in the whole of his being. He did indeed look very nervous.
"Pidu, what's the matter?"
she tried to tease, noticing his fidgeting hands.
"What is it?"
She tried again, smiling.
"Nothing. It's nothing,"
he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Giuseppe then steeled himself and reached for her hand. She took it, and he led her onto the cafe patio. As the river nearby glimmered and the soft hum of street musicians added to the ambiance, Giuseppe Morello would ask young Maria to be his wife.
"Will you marry me?"
Giuseppe asked with a tremble.
"Yes,"
she said, almost stunned, although this was exactly what she had been hoping for. Giuseppe slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to pull her into a tight embrace. They held each other for some time. In a lifetime of violence and treachery, this would be one of those few moments of purity. As the sun dipped below the horizon and Corleone began to quiet for the night, the couple lingered there, basking in the moment. Giuseppe had given Maria the promise of forever, but under the Sicilian stars, forever wouldn't last. The new couple would marry and move into a cottage of their own, which was also located on the estate. Not long after, they would conceive a daughter they would name Angela. However, in 19th century Sicily, times were hard, and with medical care primitive at best, children often died of maladies unknown. Their baby girl Angela would fall victim to this fate. Both parents were distraught over the loss, but they did not have time to grieve. Soon Maria was pregnant with their second child, a son named Calogero, after Morello's birth father. Their young family would find happiness for a short time, but fate is a cruel taskmaster, and it came looking for Giuseppe Morello. He was in the family garden picking grapes and olives with his younger brother Ciro when their father came jogging up.
"Pidu, send your brother home and come with me,"
his stepfather said in the sternest of Sicilian.
"Yes, father,"
Giuseppe said, and immediately followed. Ciro bolted for the cottage, as he knew his father's stern gaze brooked no argument. After Ciro had left, the two men walked quickly in silence. There was a heaviness in the air, and both of them could feel it. Moments later, Giuseppe and Bernardo arrived at the gate where half a dozen other men had gathered around a small fire. One of the men was speaking as they joined the group.
"We must traverse every street and alley, roust whoever we must. We will not let them capture our padrone."
Upon their arrival, Giuseppe's stepfather immediately began organizing the men. Each man was to head to a targeted location to search for the man in question. Anyone who might have information was to be interrogated vigorously. If found, the target, a local prosecutor named Giovanni Vella, was to be killed on the spot. Giuseppe was assigned to what Bernardo assumed would be one of the least likely places. This was typical, as his stepfather always tried to keep him away from the more violent parts of their life. This time, however, Bernardo Terranova could not protect his stepson. The men split up and began to search. Giuseppe was sent to check 2 houses on the other side of town where Vella might be hiding. As he rounded the corner and entered the back alley adjacent to the home of a friend of the prosecutor, he ran right into his target. The 2 men locked eyes, each completely shocked to see the other. Giovanni Vella was no shrinking violet, however. In addition to being a prosecutor, he was also a captain of the field guard and a veteran of several fatal encounters. Because of this, it took him less than a second to shake the surprise and wonder from his mind and reach for his gun. Giuseppe hesitated for only a second longer, but it was enough time for Vella to get the drop on him. However, in what would become a recurring theme in his life, Providence would favor Giuseppe Morello. Vella's shot made a whizzing sound as it missed Morello's head by just inches. Before he could fire again, Giuseppe fired his own gun. His bullet struck Vella high in the chest, driving him to the ground. Still with violent intent, Vella raised his gun from his prone position in the dirt. However, before he could squeeze the trigger, Giuseppe fired a second time. This shot struck Vella in the head, killing the man instantly. In shock, Morello fled through the back alley. Young Giuseppe had been involved in other murders, but this was the first time he had actually pulled the trigger himself. All rational thought left his mind, and he began to run. He fled in such a panic that he failed to notice one of Vella's neighbors had been hanging her wash at the time that the first shots were fired. When she saw the crime, Anna de Puma held her mouth as if trying to bottle up a scream that wanted to spill forth. Then she went into her cottage and put on her nightcoat. Meanwhile, Giuseppe ran back to the manor at top speed. Coincidentally, the first person he ran into after entering the gate was his padrone, Paolo Streva. After catching his breath, Giuseppe quickly recounted the events of the shooting to his padrone.
You have done good work, young man,
Streva intoned as his younger counterpart flushed with pride. Before much more could be said, the rest of Streva's men began arriving, including his stepfather. Evidently, news of the shooting had traveled quickly. As they gathered, one man from the group began speaking quickly.
A local woman named Anna de Puma has been telling anyone with ears that Giuseppe killed the prosecutor.
Angry murmurs greeted this. Cutting through the noise, Streva turned to his young bodyguard Antonio and spoke with a quiet forcefulness as everyone else listened.
Antonio, can you remove this stone from my shoe?
However, before Antonio could answer, Giuseppe spoke again.
It must be me, padrone. It is my life and honor.
The words he spoke seemed to hang in the air for a moment, like a silent oath. Streva stood there quietly, as if to take the measure of the young man before him. Then he spoke.
Very well, Giuseppe. Do what must be done,
he said, his stare now boring into the young man. Giuseppe returned his gaze.
Yes, padrone,
he said quietly, and with that, Giuseppe left the estate and snuck back into the town of Corleone. As he crept through the night, he felt like a ghost, moving carefully and hiding behind shadow. Quietly he crept until he saw exactly what he was looking for. Like smoke, he entered the home through an open window. In her bedroom, Anna de Puma heard a rustling coming from her kitchen. She rose from bed and lit a candle to investigate. Fear gripped her as she crept down the hall. She spun around the corner and leapt into the kitchen, nearly toppling over in the process. No one was there. Anna sighed with relief, but the moment she tried to inhale again, she felt a silk cord cutting off her air. Before she could understand what was happening, darkness crashed in from all sides. The next morning, Anna de Puma was found in her shanty. She had been strangled to death. Giuseppe had awoken early, only to find his stepfather Bernardo waiting by his bedside. There was a look on his face that put a seed of fear into Giuseppe's heart. Seeing his stepson awake, Bernardo spoke earnestly to his son.
You must go, Giuseppe. It will not be safe for you here. Even now, the authorities look for evidence to hang you. We will care for your family. You must go to America. We have people waiting for you at the port in New York City."
Giuseppe was shocked, but just shook his head. He felt an immense sadness descend upon him. He must leave everyone whom he'd ever loved behind. In a word, Giuseppe Morello was devastated. So it was that after much crying and many embraces, Giuseppe Morello bid his family farewell and boarded a vessel bound for the New World. Back home, his associates in Corleone fixed things so a political opponent named Francesco Ortinello was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Vella. Giuseppe Morello received this news not long after he arrived in America. When his boat arrived at the Ellis Island port, Morello was astounded by the different people and languages surrounding him. After being processed and paroled into the city, he walked to the address he had written on a small piece of paper. Giuseppe was taken aback as he walked among the buildings that seemed to linger like giants. Everywhere he looked, there were innovations and modern conveniences he could only dream of in Corleone. Buildings were lit by gas or electricity, and mixed in with horses and buggies were streetcars and railways. Telegraphs and telephones were everywhere, and there were thousands of theaters and saloons for entertainment. By the time he arrived at the tenement, his head was reeling. Opening the door, his distant cousin Sal welcomed him in. It would be a long time before he slept. When Morello hit the streets of Manhattan, the poverty he encountered was extreme, and the gangs mostly ran the streets with impunity, just like back home. However, unlike back home, there was a prevailing attitude of hope and a feeling that things were looking up, which differed significantly from the dour, everyday reality experienced by most Sicilians. Morello got a job quickly working on the docks, and it wasn't long before illegitimate opportunities began to spring up and he began to capitalize. Through his cousin Sal's old world connections, Morello was placed in charge of the shape-up by a fellow paisan from Corleone named Rodrigo. During the shape-up, a large group of available workers would gather, and Morello would select a crew from the assembled line for that day's work. This system was often corrupt, inefficient, and brutal. However, for Giuseppe, it proved to be lucrative. Soon he was receiving a kickback from a whole shift of longshoremen. A percentage of the proceeds would be kicked up to Rodrigo, of course. Also, Sal would get his cut. During the course of his time running the shape-up, he also learned that it could be quite lucrative to look the other way when some particularly valuable cargo arrived in the dock. Giuseppe would never consider informing the police on even his worst enemy, but the many thieves that worked the docks didn't know that, and thus would pay Giuseppe a tidy sum to keep his mouth shut. Rodrigo and Sal, of course, got a piece of this as well. Before long, Morello had saved enough money to bring his family from across the Atlantic. Arriving from Corleone were his wife Maria, his son Calogero, his mother and stepfather, along with all of his brothers and sisters. As the Terranova clan arrived in the harbor, Ellis Island buzzed with the chatter of immigrants arriving in the New World. Many waited for their families as they were processed by immigration officials. Among them, Giuseppe nervously waited on the docks of New York Harbor. It had been nearly a year since he had left his family behind in Italy, and he missed them dearly, especially his wife and son. Beside him, other immigrants craned their necks searching for familiar faces. The gangplank was then lowered, and passengers began to disembark. Giuseppe's eyes darted from one figure to the next, searching for the people who meant the world to him. After a moment, he was able to spot them. Maria holding their son Calogero, flanked by his parents and all of his siblings. Then she saw him as well, and her face lit up with joy. Tears began streaming down as she whispered, "Giuseppe." She quickened her pace, carrying Calogero. Then he swept Maria into his arms, holding her and his young son close. His parents approached next, with his mother's hands trembling as she cupped his face. "Pidu, my boy," she said, her voice breaking. His stepfather, usually stoic, embraced him with uncharacteristic tenderness. Finally, Giuseppe turned to his brothers. They were nearly men now, their youthful faces lined from the journey and the years of hard work in the fields. They shared an embrace, with a silent understanding passing between them. His sister stood there as well, looking radiant in the sunlight. Together, they looked out into the ocean as a family reunited. For Giuseppe, the chaos of the harbor, along with the city's towering buildings and bustling streets, faded away. Together, they began their walk into the heart of New York City, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The family settled into their own East Harlem tenement, with the men getting day work through Giuseppe shortly thereafter. During this time, Giuseppe received word from a cousin in New Orleans that there would be plenty of work available down there for young, strong Italians. He dismissed this offer at first, as things were going well in New York. However, life would take a downward turn in just a few months. It was a warm, bright spring morning, and Giuseppe had arrived at the docks early to begin the day. He had just begun to size up the labor pool when his younger brother Niccolo ran up to bring him the news.
"Rodrigo is dead. The White Hand has killed him,"
Niccolo said in a bewildered tone. Giuseppe stood quietly and absorbed this new information. The White Hand was a confederation of loosely knit Irish gangs that had been gaining power in the city. The most notorious was a gang who called themselves the Potashes and were led by the deadly Red Meehan. Giuseppe sighed. This was going to be trouble. After a long silence, Niccolo would venture further.
"What do you suppose it means?"
Morello spit on the ground and sighed.
"Whatever it is, we'll find out soon enough."
Later that afternoon, a group of Irish hoods arrived at the dock. These men walked with a purpose, and they knew exactly who they were looking for. They picked Giuseppe out immediately. A young man with blonde hair and a red face approached smiling. He walked to within inches of Giuseppe's face and then spit on the ground beside him.
"The Potashes are running the docks now. If you want to work, you come to the shape-up, like everyone else."
Niccolo's face reddened with anger. For a moment, he and the Irishman looked like brothers. Though enraged himself, Morello was not foolish. He quietly grabbed Niccolo before he could give voice to his anger.
"Come, Niccolo," he whispered. "No victory can be won here today."
As he said this, he quietly pulled his brother away from the scrum. After returning home, Giuseppe spoke with his father and brothers privately.
"Things are different here. It's not like back home. Here the Irish are in control. We should move to New Orleans, where the Italians have a strong presence. There our family can grow strong also. What say you, father?"
Bernardo Terranova looked around the room at his sons, who were now all young men. Then he spoke.
"Strength comes from only God, our family, and our people. We will go to New Orleans."
After a bit more discussion, the men all agreed, and the family packed for their journey. Upon their arrival, Giuseppe and his brothers found work with their cousin on a large sugar plantation in Louisiana. The work was hard, but slowly, the family began to get back on their feet. They would travel with the work, going from Texas to pick cotton, and then traveling back to New Orleans to work the docks. However, fate would again come calling for Giuseppe Morello. Upon returning to Louisiana after one of these trips, Ciro would contract malaria, which would spread throughout the entire family. With everyone sick and unable to work, the decision was made to return to New York City. Things got even more difficult soon after the Terranovas departed north, when baby Calogero also took ill and died. His death rocked the entire family, but it would affect the young boy's mother the most. Both physically sick as well as homesick, Maria would return to Sicily instead of traveling with the family back to New York in hopes of recovering her health. Instead, she would die 6 months later. As for Giuseppe, he and the rest of the family would arrive in New York City for the second and final time. The Terranova clan arrived on the streets of Manhattan for the second time after well over a year of traveling and working in the southern United States. Italian Harlem was in many ways as it had been in decades past, an ethnic enclave where government and authority were mistrusted at best and hated at worst. In this way, it was much like Corleone. What had changed upon his return was that the Italian population in New York had tripled in number. There were now more than 200,000 in the city. All of a sudden, they greatly outnumbered the Irish and other ethnicities in the area. Italian Harlem was one of those places. Morello and his family purchased a tenement in its heart on Prince Street. Work was plentiful, and the opportunity to turn a buck on the wrong side of the law was there also. It wasn't long before he and his brothers were again involved in the rackets. Soon the four acquired enough money to purchase a building that they planned on making a saloon. Just down the street from the tenement, there was a building that fit the bill perfectly. The only problem was that its current owners went by the surname of Lupo, and both the father and his sons had violent reputations. The old man Rocco Lupo was intimidating despite his age, but it was his middle-aged son, known as Ignazio the Wolf, that had the fiercest reputation in the streets. Morello and his brothers knew Ignazio Lupo and the young crew that worked for him as some of the most violent men in the city. The Wolf, a truly terrifying man, was rumored to have killed dozens, leaving many of them in barrels to be discovered when the smell became too rancid. The fear was so pervasive in the neighborhood that men would cross the street to avoid him, and women would make the sign of the cross at the mere mention of his name. With such a reputation, the brothers knew to be extremely wary. When Morello, his stepfather, and his three half-brothers arrived at 8 Prince Street, they hoped the negotiations would be short. As they arrived, a stout man with a dour expression met them at the door. This Morello knew to be the Wolf himself. He walked them to a table in back, speaking as they went. "I know of your family from back in Corleone," Lupo said, speaking to Morello. "You and your stepfather are both men of respect. This is the only reason why I'm here today talking to you," Lupo continued. When Bernardo and Giuseppe stayed silent, Lupo continued without emotion. 5,000 for the land and the building." He paused then, as a predatory smile creased his lips. "Also, my saloon is right across the street, should you need protection." Though these last words were said in a near whisper, they reverberated throughout the room nonetheless. There was a silence for a long moment as Lupo grinned sardonically at the Terranovas. This offer of protection was actually a threat of extortion, and every man in the room knew it for what it was. Young Niccolo's face reddened at the implied threat and was about to begin yelling when Bernardo cut him off. "No protection is needed, Signor Lupo, and 5,000 is fair. However, we are a private clan. Any attempt to interfere in our business will not be tolerated. So long as we have that understanding, we can move forward." Lupo had paid the old man little mind until now, choosing to speak to Morello instead. Now he was on alert, in tune with the ebb and flow of the room. The two men locked eyes and stared each other down for an uncomfortable moment. An understanding seemed to pass between them, and finally Lupo spoke again. "It is done then," and shook the old man's hand. The threat had been rebuffed, and it seemed as if some silent test had been passed. The Morello Terranova clan was to be respected. On the walk back to the tenement, a silence spread among the five. As they rounded the corner into an alleyway walk-up, Giuseppe pulled his half-brother Niccolo aside as the others entered the building. "I saw your anger. So did Father. You must learn to think before you act. A man like Lupo can be very dangerous. By showing your anger, you allow yourself to be manipulated and led around by your nose. Do you understand this, Niccolo?" Morello said with conviction. "Listen, brother, I just didn't," Niccolo started before his brother cut him off. "Just nothing. Think first, then speak. That is all. And if you can't do that, just be silent." Sufficiently cowed, the way only his father and older brother could, Niccolo nodded his head and slunk inside. And for the rest of the night, that was all there was. Giuseppe Morello was correct about a great many things that night. One of them was that Ignazio Lupo was not a man to be trifled with. That was just a fact of life for residents of Italian Harlem during that time. He and his father had arrived 2 years prior with their family and opened a grocery and saloon. It wasn't long before the Lupos had a crew of family and close friends which they used to extort businessmen and working men alike. However, the Terranovas were not peasants or people to be thought of little account. They were part of the honored society in Sicily. Stories from back home of the Terranova clan, especially of young Giuseppe Morello himself, had reached the ears of both Ignazio Lupo and his father. And so Lupo had chosen to respect the Terranovas, and Morello in particular. This in turn caused the reputation of the Morello Terranova men to flourish in Italian Harlem. Their association with Lupo made them men to be feared. Soon the clan had begun to dabble in their old rackets from back home, along with some new ones the family had either innovated or imitated. Morello restarted their old counterfeiting operation from back in Sicily, using a local shop proprietor from the old country named Giuseppe Joe the Grocer Catania. He would also open the first Italian lottery in Harlem. Along with the saloon, Morello soon owned a coal distribution shop, diversifying his income. Over the coming months, an alliance between Lupo and Morello began to materialize. The Terranova brothers and some of the other young toughs from the neighborhood were soon acting as muscle for Lupo's extortion racket. As the two families grew closer, Lupo became increasingly fond of Terranova's sister, Salvatrice. Both had a penchant for gossip, and the two would often chat about local characters in the neighborhood. When around her, Lupo's exterior seemed to soften a bit, but as soon as another person was within earshot, up went the mask of the wolf. And when the mask was up, Ignazio radiated a danger that was easily perceived by those around him, even if they knew nothing of his exploits. However, Lupo was always respectful, courteous, and generous when it came to Salvatrice, earning both Father Bernardo's and Brother Giuseppe's respect. Both also saw how a marriage between the families would be of strategic advantage. As the men became closer, many of their rackets began to overlap. Together, they grew rich very quickly. Many nights, the men who made up parts of the burgeoning New York underworld would gather at the saloon on 8 Prince Street to commiserate and plan their next scores. Morello and his brothers were there often, as was the elder Lupo and his son. Top Morello enforcer Tomasio the Ox Petto was also there, along with thugs such as Vito La Duca and Giuseppe De Primo. Men of respect from the old country would mix with brutal cutthroats in this underworld harbor. This sordid cast of characters would sit around the table playing cards and drinking, and imagining new ways to turn a buck on the wrong side of the law. Meanwhile, across town, a police officer entered an interrogation room and began to savagely beat a suspect while simultaneously verbally berating him in Italian. The officer had a smallpox-scarred face and was short, even by the standards of the day. He stood at 5'3" and customarily wore lifts in his shoes to augment his height. Despite being short, the officer looked like a fireplug, tipping the scales at just under 300 pounds. With his powerfully built frame, he rained blows down on his suspect. "We know you killed him, Vito," the middle-aged cop said in an almost instructive tone. The man receiving the beating, however, said nothing. "We have 2 witnesses that put you at the scene of the crime," he continued while landing another blow with the thick law volume, which on that day was administering its own version of street justice. "Perhaps you'd like to tell us again about the counterfeit $5 bill instead," the officer continued with a sardonic grin. That grin suggested that its owner was in fact enjoying the beating he was doling out. And God help him, that was the truth. Sergeant Giuseppe Joe Petrosino had no use for the young Italian hoods that were giving his people a bad name. Hoods like this Vito Cassioferro, who was currently laying in a pool of his own blood and stinking up his interrogation room. They were in the process of charging this man with murder. However, in his heart, Petrosino felt like they were just going through the motions. Though he did not like to admit it, he knew from past experience that the murder would never stick. In situations like this, witnesses would usually disappear and suspects would then go free. If that was an impossibility, then it would be the suspect who would make bail and then disappear, usually back into the waiting arms of his family in the old country. Cassioferro was involved with the Black Hand in Italian Harlem, and for Petrosino, bringing down the Black Hand was his private obsession. Joe Petrosino, however, was as patient as he was tough, and later tonight he would be meeting an informant that he had developed who was going to help him bring down the largest Black Hand gang in Manhattan. It was a crew of thugs that this Mr. Cassioferro knew very well. Later that evening, Joe Petrosino prepared to head out for the night. He was a wise old head and knew better than to meet his informant anywhere near East New York or Harlem. Instead, they met in an Irish pub in Woodlawn Heights. As he entered the bar, stares from the patrons bore into him as he tried to remain inconspicuous. After a moment, the patrons returned to their drinks and Petrosino spotted the scumbag he was looking for. The man he was meeting was already seated in a booth with a shot and a chaser. Petrosino then piled in across from him and waited silently. After 20 seconds or so of this, the man gave up and began speaking.
I heard Joe the grocer brag about how he's Giuseppe Morello's right hand and how they're getting rich printing counterfeit bills.
The man trailed off as Petrosino stared.
Where are they printing them?
Petrosino asked.
I don't know where they make them, but Joe will let it slip eventually,
the informant answered. Petrosino, ever the patient man, waited for more. When nothing more was forthcoming, Petrosino made his last statement.
You want the robbery charge to go away? You find out where they're making the bills.
The man started to protest, but before he could, Petrosino was on his feet and out the door. As the weeks went by, Petrosino and his squad of officers began observing 8 Prince Street and occasionally harassing its patrons. Daily they would roust local thugs out of their domiciles up and down Prince Street, repeatedly questioning members of the Lupo and Morello crews. The extra heat on his establishment and his men was not lost on Giuseppe Morello. One afternoon, as they watched a beat cop frisk one of their boys, Niccolo remarked to his older brother, "They're everywhere now." Morello, who'd had this very thought some weeks ago, then wondered aloud, "Why do you suppose that is?" Niccolo remained silent. Then, not necessarily in an answer to the question, remarked, "Joe has a big mouth, doesn't he?" "Yes, he does," Morello said with quiet finality. They exchanged a look of understanding before Morello got up and went inside. Later that night, Morello met with Lupo alone. As the two sat at a private table in the rear of the restaurant, Morello would use an old Sicilian proverb about removing a stone from his shoe. It was a metaphor, and Joe the grocer was the stone. Lupo, impressed by this witticism, decides he will use it later. As for the job, getting rid of the gregarious loudmouth Joe the grocer will be a pleasure he will take personally. A few days would pass, and with the end of the week at hand, the saloon was packed with criminals and knockaround guys of every sort. Joe the grocer Catania was, as always, at the end of the bar, talking to anyone within earshot at the top of his lungs. Ignazio Lupo, while well known in Italian Harlem, was often willfully ignored by most patrons due to the pervasive fear of him among the local populace. It was partly due to this that he was able to settle in the corner of the saloon relatively unnoticed. Here, he began to listen to Joe the grocer drunkenly brag to any and all. After an hour had passed, and he was sure the man was already intoxicated, Ignazio Lupo approached his friend at the bar and called for a drink.
"Giuseppe, how are you? May I sit down?"
Lupo said, already sitting. Immediately on guard despite his drunkenness, Catania replied,
"Of course, Don Lupo,"
giving the respect to Lupo despite Catania being the older man. The two began to chat, with Lupo reminding Catania to pick up the dry goods that they had gotten out of bond for their respective groceries. Catania agreed immediately, of course, and after 2 more drinks and more drunken laughter, Lupo finally excused himself, embracing Catania and kissing him on the cheek before leaving the saloon. After Lupo left, Catania visibly relaxed along with the rest of the bar. He spent the next 2 hours drinking continuously before finally beginning the trek home. He drunkenly weaved in the street, even chatting with a prostitute for a block as they walked together. Finally, he rounded into the alleyway and entered his home. When he did, some instinctual alarm began going off in his head. Perhaps because he was drunk, or perhaps because he had stopped listening to that particular alarm clock long ago, Catania continued inside. The last thing he would see would be a strange man sitting at his table. The next moment, Lupo stepped from his concealment in the closet and shot Catania in the back of the head. He then spit on the corpse before yelling, "Put him in a barrel and leave him at the dump." His men immediately complied. It would be weeks before the body of Joe Catania was found in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn. Detective Petrosino arrived as soon as he heard of the discovery. The official identification was going to take some time, as the man's face was completely unrecognizable. However, papers on his person confirmed the identity for Petrosino. He was already in a foul mood that morning after learning that Vito Cassioferro had in fact been bailed out. Now, with another body discovered in a barrel, pressure would be ratcheting up to find those responsible. Or rather, to find someone to hold responsible anyway. Petrosino hated the corruption he was forced to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but he never let it deter him. "It's just one scumbag killing another," he heard a detective say. "No great loss." This man's attitude bothered Petrosino nearly as much as the crime did, and he had to restrain himself from berating the detective who'd made the comment. He long ago realized that the Morello gang would be a tough nut to crack. The gang's leaders were very selective of who they would work with, and all followed the ancient Sicilian practice of omertà, making infiltration difficult. As 1902 turned to 1903, Giuseppe Morello assumed day-to-day leadership of the clan due to Bernardo's declining health. The Morello Terranova clan numbered nearly 40 at that time and continued to expand their criminal horizons into new areas, such as loan sharking and gambling, while strengthening their existing rackets, including extortion, numbers, and counterfeiting. During Bernardo's illness, his daughter Salvatrice cared for him night and day. Ignazio Lupo, now openly courting Salvatrice, supported her as she supported him. It was a day in late spring when Lupo appeared at the doorway of Bernardo's quarters. The two had grown closer since the first meeting at the saloon, and Lupo approached the older man with obvious respect. "Padrone, you are a wise man, and I'm sure you know why I've come to you in this late hour. Your health is failing, and I do not want to lose you to God before asking you this question." Lupo said this in a manner that would have shocked any of the men who worked for him. Bernardo, of course, knew the question Ignazio Lupo would ask. "You wish to marry my daughter?" Bernardo said in a wheeze. Salvatrice was the apple of her father's eye, as everyone knew, and his refusal would brook no argument. "I trust you to care for her," Bernardo said in a hoarse whisper. "You have my permission to be married." The two men shared an awkward embrace, and the matter was closed. Bernardo Terranova would pass away less than a month later, with his adopted son Giuseppe officially accepting the reins of leadership. The Morello Terranova clan and the Lupo gang slowly merged into a single cohesive criminal organization. The marriage of Salvatrice Terranova to Ignazio Lupo was more than just the union of a woman and a man. It was the creation of the first American Mafia family. After the wedding, another ceremony took place. At the table during this ceremony, there was no wedding cake. Instead, there was a knife and a gun. A saint was then burned, and after it was finished, the Morello crime family had been born. The boss, or father of the family, Giuseppe Morello, appointed Ignazio Lupo as his underboss, or second in command. There, Lupo would operate as his right hand and chief enforcer. With their combined strength, the two were poised to rule the rackets throughout the city. Hello everyone, OC here, and I'm the voice behind the channel. If you guys enjoy these dramatizations, please like and share often. This is my second edit of La Cosa Nostra: The Beginning. These new episodes will have more content and what I hope will be improved storytelling as well as production. As I release the second edition of the beginning videos, I'll also be writing and recording rough drafts of future spin-offs La Familia Columbo and La Familia Genovese. I'll also be working on spin-offs for the Outfit and the Philly Mob soon. I appreciate all of the support. Thank you very much.